and thank you everyone who's come to this session. Anti-Semitism is a menace to Jews today. In Britain, we find it in politics, in culture, on social media, on the streets. We find it in populist nationalisms in Eastern Europe, in white nationalism in the United States, and in jihadist Islamism. But is the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism a useful tool as we respond to these dangers? The working definition is a two-page document. It features a core which states that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred. And it contains a piecemeal list of examples of where this perception may be found today. Published in 2016, it's been adopted by 25 countries, and in the UK by the government, political parties, local authorities, universities, football clubs, among others. Yet, it also provokes controversy. It has been forcefully criticized recently by the president of the New Israel Fund. The United Nations has advocated its use in some contexts, but expressed caution about its use in others. And this raises a key question. What is the definition good for? Supporters invest it with three functions: symbolic, operational, and educational. So let's take a look at each of them. First, the working definition has become a symbol of opposition to anti-Semitism. And we saw this recently when the Premier League adopted the working definition. I know well the revolting anti-Semitism reproduced at football stadia. Interestingly, most of the things said and chanted about Jews at football grounds are not covered by the examples in the working definition. But this isn't the point. In this case, it is less the content of the working definition that counts, but the fact that it is adopted at all. Football clubs adopting the working definition make a vivid symbolic statement opposing anti-Semitism. Second, the working definition is promoted as an operational document in order to manage speech and behavior. The illustrations are presented as guidelines for political parties, universities, and others to use to eradicate anti-Semitism and protect Jews. Here, the definition has been given a practical function as well as a symbolic one. And in this regard, unfortunately, it fails. The working definition actually provides Jews with weaker protection than UK equality law. At its core is the statement that, quote, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews. In other words, according to the definition, whether or not anti-Semitism exists in any particular case depends on whether the person accused perceives Jews in a particular way. No perception, then no anti-Semitism. This is a feeble and outdated approach. Today, under UK equality law, the identification of harassment and discrimination does not depend on the perceptions of the person accused, but on the impact on the victim. And this gives Jews and other religious and racial minorities greater protection. It is no coincidence that when the IHRA found agents of the Labour Party had harassed Jews and that the party's procedures discriminated against Jews, it relied on equality law, not the IHRA working definition. Our best protection as Jews lies in insisting that institutions and associations adhere to equality law and the codes of conduct built on its provisions. Although it is weak, the working definition also carries a danger. This arises from the fact that its supporters cannot agree on what it says. Some organizations promote a nuanced understanding. They emphasize a passage which states that all potential cases of anti-Semitism need to be examined in context. We find this in the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust's commendable briefing paper on the subject. Here we are told that boycotting Israel, for example, is not inherently anti-Semitic, according to the working definition. Instead, the matter has to be judged according to context, case by case. Other advocacy groups take a different view. They acknowledge neither the significance of context nor the need for case-by-case examination. The Simon Wiesenthal Foundation is just one significant organization which declares the boycott movement to be inherently anti-Semitic, and whose interpretation of the working definition leads them to call for the suppression of voices which advocate for equality for Palestinians. So according to one interpretation, the working definition does not threaten free speech and legitimate protest. But among others, their interpretation ends up posing a threat to legitimate civil protest and freedom of expression under the law. This disagreement among the working definition supporters is one reason why it faces opposition, even from the president of the New Israel Fund. Finally, the definition is promoted as an educational document. Here it contains useful elements. For example, it draws attention to the way critical discussion of Israel can turn anti-Semitic. But overall, as an aid to understanding, the definition is flawed. First, the text places stress on anti-Semitism as a form of hatred. This is dangerously misleading. Anti-Semitism can involve hatred, but often it does not. Think of the stereotypes which pervade our culture, such as the idea that Jews are tribal and do not care for the general good. These ideas are unquestionably anti-Semitic, but they are more likely to manifest as contempt or aversion than as hatred. Second, the definition does not include significant aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism. The concept of institutional anti-Semitism is not included, and it is inexcusably silent on the threat we face from the far right, the sort of anti-Semitism which motivated the murderous attacks on synagogues at Pittsburgh and Halle. I shall sum up. The IHRA working definition is an effective symbol, but in other respects, it is ill-conceived and outdated. We must do better than this.
Weaker than equality law. Of course, it's weaker than equality law because it's a non-legal definition. It's the whole point of it. For things below the criminal threshold, doesn't substitute for the law. It adds to it. It expands on it. Precisely, you use the words contempt and aversion. You're not going to get a prosecution on aversion, on someone's contempt, on someone's isolation of somebody, of somebody's attitude, of somebody's discomfort. And that's the whole point. I'm surprised that you've not built in the arguments you've put in your previous articles, because you've written a lot over the last 10 years, David, on this. The 10 years you've been director of the academic institute. And you've done so very politically. An article on the 2nd of December in The Guardian, your last one, you described me as the anti-Semitism czar. Now, you're a historian, director of an institute on anti-Semitism, who's written about the czars and anti-Semitism as part of your academic work. You're very aware of the connotations of the use of the word czar. But in describing me, you politically, to play to a political audience, chose to use a term that doesn't exist. I'm not a czar, a tabloid term, not my official title. And that begs quite a big question about what's going on here, because I don't give a damn what people call me. But for a historian who writes on the czars and anti-Semitism, to label me that is not an accident. I wonder why you did that. A letter to the New Democratic Party of Canada last week and I quote, talks of an established history of IHRA being co-opted in attempt to suppress freedom of expression. It cites you. It cites Kenneth Stern. Kenneth Stern, who spoke at Birkbeck last week, cited you a lot. You cite Kenneth Stern a lot. Saul Azinski, an academic who was also on that Birkbeck lecture on IHRA and free speech, also cites you both an awful lot. In fact, in 160 pages, he gives you between you a lot of pages. It's your institute, not your specific personal one, but your university, Birkbeck. IHRA and free speech, 3 speakers. When I asked to go on the panel, to put a different perspective, to suggest that IHRA didn't curtail free speech, I was told no. And the professor who chaired it, the first question she asked is extremely important in this debate. Professor Jacqueline Gold, to the 3 Birkbeck panelists last week. Has IHRA become a prescriptive legal tool to deem some speech unacceptable? Because that's what the articles in Canada, in the United States, plenty of articles in this country are saying, citing your good self. But as you've almost pointed out, and it would be accurate if you did, IHRA is not a legal tool. By definition, it's not a legal tool. That's its very strength. Now, you say repeatedly that it chills free speech. You've not used the term today, but in repeated articles over the last 10 years you have done, and others have mimicked that, using the word chill and free speech. Have you, David, ever researched the experience of Jewish students and anti-Semitism in universities? Have you asked the universities who've adopted IHRA what their experience of it is? You talk in the theoretical, but what about the actual? You see, quite a lot of universities have adopted IHRA for quite a long time, as have political parties. Have you talked to the Scottish government, who adopted it 3 years ago, about their experience? Has it chilled free speech in Scotland? Plaid Cymru, who've adopted it, the Liberal Democrats who've adopted it, along with all the other political parties at Westminster. Have you asked them if it's chilled their free speech? Because nobody has suggested that it has. The non-legal definition, the working definition, is its key strength. I use slightly different language to you. The golf club racism, they're being ostracized, they're being shunned, they're being picked upon. That's precisely what it does. Now, your key ally, Kenneth Stern, who you cite a lot in your articles, is in favor of free speech. Are you in favor of free speech for David Starkey? Or should there be consequences for free speech? You cite in your articles the Home Affairs Select Committee throughout the years, but you've missed their second recommendation. What is that second recommendation that you missed out? Because an academic will obviously put all the evidence forward before drawing conclusions. And finally, can you show us any actual examples of the use of IHRA, rather than non-examples or theoreticals, in it actually chilling free speech, in it stopping academic freedom, in it curtailing academic research, as those who cite you repeatedly claim?
Sure. I think, I mean, a lot of what John said was an attack on me and things I'm supposed to have done, rather than about the IHRA. I'll just say that John gave the impression that I've been writing ceaselessly about the IHRA working definition over the last 5 years. In fact, it took up 2 small paragraphs at the end of an article I published in 2016, and I was silent on the subject until the piece I wrote for The Guardian earlier this month. That's all I've done in the press about the IHRA. It's not true to say that I'm a campaigner on the subject. And John's absolutely correct to say that there was a meeting at Birkbeck earlier this month. I think if John has issues about that meeting, he needs to take them up with people other than me. I will say that I make it a point that whenever the Pears Institute deals with controversial political issues, we have a spectrum of opinion on the panel. I do not use it as a place in which there is only one view which is given. Just the other thing, I'll say that I apologize to John if he was offended by my use of the term czar. It's used in the press quite regularly, including by the Times, when John's role is discussed, but I certainly won't use it again myself. I think the key issue which John raised concerns free speech. Am I in favor of free speech for racists? Absolutely not. And as I tried to say, if everyone had the same consistent interpretation of the IHRA working definition as is given in the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust's briefing paper, then I would be aware of its many other weaknesses, but it would not hold the dangers that I believe it does hold. And in this, I really want to say the problem is not with me, but with the people who misinterpret, but loudly and powerful organizations which misinterpret the IHRA working definition, which treat the examples as a tick box exercise rather than as indicative cases which need to be looked at in context with nuance. And this brings me perhaps to the last point, which is, are there examples where the IHRA working definition has been invoked to prevent events taking place? And the answer is yes, on occasion it has. For example, in the case of Israel Apartheid Week at the University of Central Lancashire. I should say that Israel Apartheid Week is not something I particularly care to support. But we live in a society in which protest and free speech ought to be free speech within the law, and free speech which is not racist speech, which is not anti-Semitic speech, ought to be allowed. So there are occasions, and beyond that, some people want to say, for example, Leslie Claff in the Jewish Chronicle recently argued that using the term settler colonialism is anti-Semitic under the IHRA working definition. Now, again, I'm not a great advocate of the settler colonial interpretation of Israel. It has some strong points, it has some weak points, but it's part of the academic discourse. And so I think that John is not quite right when he says that some interpretations of the IHRA working definition can't have a chilling effect. They do. And he's wrong to say that it's never been implemented, because it has. And he's wrong to say that I've been writing ceaselessly on the subject for the last 6 years, because I have not.
Yeah, and the reason it's important and the way it's been used by many institutions, by many countries, is because simply to rely on the criminal law sets too high a threshold for dealing with any form of discrimination. Anti-Semitism has been one of the more difficult forms of discrimination for people to get their head round, understand, and deal with. But if you look at the number of anti-Semitic incidents in universities, 123 over the last 2 years, 65 last year, including 4 assaults, then it's a problem. For that in our universities in 2020, it's a significant problem. And the point of a working definition is it allows things to be looked at in the context they happen, the behaviours that are there, without having to go into formal disciplinary procedures or bring in the police. And crucially, the bringing in of the police. If you argue, as David argued, and others have argued, that what we should be using are existing laws, then existing laws are criminal laws. Now, if we take an institution like Birkbeck, if every complaint from a Jewish student was referred to the police, then the police would be doing nothing else with their time, across London in particular, than dealing with complaints from students. But the vast majority of things, the overwhelming majority, are below the criminal threshold. And below the criminal threshold means, for example, when you get a threat to you, but you don't know who it's from, when you're isolated, when you're shunned, when you feel uncomfortable wearing a kippah in a university because the response it will get, when you're picked on by a university lecturer, as happened recently, as the only Jewish student in a lecture, and asked in the lecture why Israelis were attacking disabled Palestinians in the West Bank, and asked to write an essay on it. The only Jewish student in an entire lecture picked on to do that. That's not illegal. But it doesn't mean that it's acceptable. And that's where the IHRA definition comes into play, and it's working well. Manchester University, Newcastle University, Leeds University, Liverpool University, London School of Economics, UCL for the last 16 months have operated it very, very effectively. Sussex University has used it to engage with the Jewish community, to empower Jewish students, to take on complaints from Jewish students, and done so brilliantly. Saying to Jewish students that discrimination against you, including the vast majority below the criminal threshold, will not be tolerated. The putting up of a swastika in a leaflet, the denying of a Holocaust on a leaflet or poster, the demonstration outside a Hillel house against Israel. These are all examples of things which cross the threshold of decency and discrimination. And the IHRA definition helps. It's why the British police has used it in its training for the last 8 years with success. It's how Borussia Dortmund football club's using it to turn round its supporters, to educate them, to challenge them, and has used the same techniques now to spread in dealing with sexism and misogyny. Chelsea Football Club. Kids who are anti-Semitic online invited in by a club that's using IHRA very effectively, training its stewards, knowing as a club what to look for, inviting in those who transgress, not to discipline them, but to engage with them. That's a damn sight better than simply throwing them out of the stadium or trying to prosecute them. On occasion, a criminal threshold will of course be met. But the adoption at Salford University, which has promoted the university for the first time in choosing to engage with its Jewish constituents, the local population with whom it's not had an effective dialogue. The same going on with Aston Villa Football Club, the same going on with Newcastle United Football Club, Liverpool Football Club just announcing a big new programme. The stuff that Brighton's doing, both the university and the football club, with the Brighton Jewish community. These are examples of the IHRA definition working. Now, David gave the example of the University of Central Lancashire. Wrong. It didn't use IHRA. It didn't even know when it made the decision to ban an Israel apartheid meet what the IHRA definition was, never mind having adopted it and using it. There are no examples of any university using the IHRA definition to chill or stop free speech. In fact, the only examples I'm aware of speakers being banned have been Israeli speakers. Seth Anzinski at the lecture that I wasn't allowed to speak at asked the question, will IHRA stop me having a member of the Knesset who opposes the Netanyahu government speaking at University College London? The answer is no, it will not. No, it does not. In fact, it's only Israelis who've been banned or attempted to be banned over the past 5 years in incidents I've had to deal with. So IHRA doesn't restrict free speech, but it does empower, particularly students and young people.
Those are good questions. First of all, I think it's important for me to acknowledge the shocking figures produced by the CST on anti-Semitism at universities, and to acknowledge at least some of what John was talking about. It seems to me that John illustrated very well the important symbolic impact that the IHRA working definition can have. But in a university context, but as an operational definition and as in terms of what students want, that's difficult. Students, what Jews think, what we think about anti-Semitism is important. It needs to be listened to, but it cannot be decisive. And it cannot be decisive because it will lead us into chaos. For example, Palestinians in this country and abroad argue, rightly or wrongly, that the IHRA working definition is an example of anti-Palestinian racism. Now, we have to assume that they mean that sincerely when they say that. So what we have here are one set of subjective views against another set of subjective views, and we're in deadlock. Moreover, if we depend on subjective views for our definitions of racism, we open the door to white nationalists, the sort of people who we saw marching at Charlottesville, who say, we feel oppressed as white people and Jews will not replace us. For these reasons, we need an objective and generalizable understanding of racism, of harassment, of discrimination. And I'll just take advantage of this question to correct John on one point, because it is not true to say that equality law leads to criminal prosecutions. Equality law is civil law. These are civil obligations. And so in other words, the options for universities is not have a hate prosecution against a lecturer or a student or do nothing. It's to implement their own codes of conduct, their own policies of dignity and study at work, and to tighten them and to tighten their procedures. And the CST report on universities has many, many useful things to say about what universities ought to do along those lines.
And of course, the student experience and the student voice should be listened to. And IHRA and the IHRA definition is not in competition either with the Equalities Act or any of the hate crime legislation at all. And institutional anti-Semitism and rooting that out is vital. But David, you didn't answer my question before. In your research over the last 10 years, and I've found 5 articles you've written on IHRA, there may be more, but have you asked Jewish students of their experience? Because you suddenly cite that it chills free speech, according to, quote, Palestinian students. There are no examples, they don't exist, of the IHRA definition being used in a university to silence debate of any kind on Israel-Palestinian issues. No such examples exist. It's a falsehood, but it's been peddled. And you're one of the people, David, with your articles who keeps saying it chills free speech. Your example of the University of Central Lancashire is a false example. But I've given examples of universities and other institutions who've used the IHRA definition with success for a number of years, not a single example of it in any way impeding academic research, academic freedom, free speech. And indeed in football, Kick It Out, the anti-racist body, have been using the IHRA definition in their training in 45 English football clubs for the last 3 years. Again, 0 examples. So if you're going to say it chills free speech, you have to demonstrate how it's done it, because it hasn't. It's very common sense, it's additional, and where it's being used, it's working very, very well.
Hi, so my question is for John specifically, and I wanted to ask you if you think BDS, so the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign, Israeli Apartheid Week, or describing Israel as settler colonialist, do meet the threshold of the IHRA definition for anti-Semitism, and if so, why?
The answer is in themselves they don't, and it's not me though who makes that judgment. I'm not the commissar in relation to anti-Semitism. It's the universities contextualizing what's going on. So let me give an example. If you do a demonstration, as happened at the University of Berkeley, California, which I'm not sure it was entitled, but let's call it anti-Israel. It may have been titled pro-Palestinian, but I will use the term anti-Israel. That's not inaccurate. That demonstration specifically took a route past the Jewish student accommodation. If you look to the IHRA definition and you brought that into play, you'd say students are entitled to demonstrate anti any government in the world they want. It's what students do. But taking that demonstration past the Jewish student accommodation is inappropriate. Why has that been done? If there had been swastikas embedded on Netanyahu's face, that's inappropriate. The use of Nazi as a terminology is inappropriate, and IHRA would give guidance and does give guidance in relation to that. And so what IHRA does, and where it's been used effectively, it looks at what happens, how it happens, so that all students are empowered, but that includes all Jewish students. If you're a Jewish student, you're entitled to be offended. And the university is entitled to allow things to happen that can offend you. But to move the stage further and isolate you, that's a different proposition. Target you, that's entirely different. You know, if you want to demonstrate against the government of Israel and its policies, go to the Israeli embassy and demonstrate against them. Don't go to a synagogue. It's exactly the same with IHRA and its use in universities. And by the way, that's exactly why football clubs trying to work out what's offensive, what isn't, why they see it as so important.
I think that because I'm the director of an institute for the study of anti-Semitism, in that sense, I'm not just any Jewish academic. So, and I'll speak for myself rather than for others. I think it's important to understand that when I speak on this, I speak as an academic. The Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism is part of a university. It's not a communal institution. And in that sense, we do research, we teach, and we engage in public debate. So I think my obligation here is as an academic to bring whatever knowledge and understanding I have to bear on public debate. And I think the rider to that is that it's not only Jewish academics who either work at the Pears Institute or who have an obligation to speak out against anti-Semitism. I would say all academics have an obligation to speak out against anti-Semitism where they find it. And there I've just contradicted myself, because I said I wouldn't tell other people what to do, and that's just what I've done.
There's no specific obligation on Jewish academics any more than Jewish students. And it's not for me to identify who people are or what they are. That's for people to self-identify. And self-identification really gets to the heart of why some people do not like this definition, because it allows people to self-identify as proud Zionists, for that to be part of their identity. And it's not for me to say whether a Jewish person should or shouldn't identify as a Zionist, a proud Zionist, a strong Zionist, a non-Zionist, an anti-Zionist. That's not my right. But it is my obligation, I think, to ensure that if you choose to identify as a Zionist, you're not going to be abused for that in your university. You're not going to be a second-class citizen. You're going to be isolated, shunned because of how you identify. And that's the strength of the IHRA definition. And that seems to upset some people. The IHRA definition isn't perfect, but no definition's perfect. I would have liked the Home Affairs Select Committee's recommendation to be incorporated, the one that David and others have selectively missed out, which is that Zionism, or worse, Zio, should not be used in an accusatory or abusive context. It should be considered inflammatory and potentially anti-Semitic. So I can improve the definition. It's not for me to improve the definition. The definition exists, and it's proving to be very useful. Nobody, including David, has managed to find a single example of its so-called misuse of its chilling free speech. David's a researcher. I invite him to go talk to Jewish students as part of his research, because that hasn't happened, to talk to the universities, the countries that have adopted it, the football clubs, the other institutions that have adopted it, and build that into his research. And what he'll find is having something below the criminal threshold is additional to the laws we have. It adds to them. It's been effective. It is empowering. And crucially, it's empowering to those who want to define themselves as Zionist without them being abused, being shunned, being vilified in their university. My experience is that that's what happens. My experience is that it's the Jewish society that's the most likely to be banned. It's the Israeli speaker who's the most likely to be attempted to be banned. Jewish students don't have more rights than anybody else in our universities, but they have equal rights. And that includes those who define themselves as Zionist. That's why this definition is so powerful. It's why it's working, and nobody has been able to give a single example of how it isn't working, because it does not restrict any free speech in relation to Israel, Palestine, or indeed anything else?
Thanks. Well, although John has sort of been a rather belligerent towards me, in fact, there's not a lot of difference between John's interpretation of the IHRA working definition and mine. The problem here, as I said before, is with other advocacy groups who take it and loudly misuse it. And the example here, again, I'll give is of the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation, which was involved in the University of Central Lancashire banning. John is correct to say that the university hadn't adopted the IHRA working definition, but others, as it were, waved it in its face. So I think if that we just had sane, careful, nuanced interpretations of the working definition, we would be having a different discussion, but we don't, and therein lies the danger. I really just want to end with saying that, emphasizing the importance of this discussion. It's important because we face a problem of anti-Semitism in the UK and in the world. The IHRA working definition can help us in some ways, but not in others, as I tried to argue in my opening statement, I tried to show, and it carries dangers which chiefly come from the ways in which some groups interpret it and try to use it as a tool to stifle others. I remain convinced that equality law gives stronger protection and is the way forward. I absolutely agree that many universities have work to do and they need to get their procedures and their codes of conduct into order. I welcome John's advice that I should do more research on this subject. That's my job, and I'll go ahead and do it. Thank you.